Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside right now, or I'm calling security. The words hung in the air at Portland International Airport like smoke from a fire that was about to consume everything in its path. Dr. Vanessa Hayes stood perfectly still at Gate C-15, her Navy Howard University hoodie suddenly feeling like a target painted on her back, while the blonde gate agent's finger pointed at her, with the kind of authority that comes from a uniform and a name tag that reads Ashley Cumberland. But let's rewind 12 hours to understand how we got here, to understand how a woman who spent her career making the skies safer for millions was about to become the center of a confrontation that would change everything for everyone involved. The alarm in room 847 of the Portland Marriott had been going off for exactly 4 minutes before Dr. Vanessa Hayes finally reached across the tangle of case files and incident reports spread across her hotel bed to silence it. 4:30 a.m. She hadn't slept, not really, just dozed fitfully between reviewing photographs of twisted metal and reading witness statements that made her stomach turn. For the past 72 hours, she had been Dr. Hayes' senior air safety investigator for the National Transportation Safety Board, the woman called in when Regional Airways Flight 445 had skidded off the runway in a thunderstorm and burst into flames. She was the one who walked through the debris field while it still smelled of jet fuel and fear, who interviewed the pilots with their hands still shaking, who measured every scratch and fracture on the engine components to understand exactly why 37 people had nearly died. Her government-issued laptop sat open on the desk, displaying her preliminary report in crisp clinical language that somehow made the terror of that night sound manageable, controllable, preventable. But Vanessa knew better than anyone that every technical failure had a human story behind it. Every safety violation was someone's decision to cut corners or ignore warnings, and every near miss was a reminder that the margin between life and death at 30,000 feet was thinner than most people could imagine. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, and she smiled for the first time in 3 days when she saw the contact photo. A gap-toothed 9-year-old girl with braids tied in purple ribbons and a smile that could power the entire hotel. Zoe. "Good morning, baby girl." Vanessa answered, her voice still rough with exhaustion. "Mommy." Zoe's voice was bright with the kind of energy that only children possess at ungodly hours of the morning. "Are you coming home today? I made you a drawing of an airplane that doesn't crash. It has extra wings and a parachute and everything." Vanessa closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the past few days settle onto her shoulders like a heavy blanket. "I'm coming home today, sweetheart. Just one more plane ride, and then Mommy will be there to see your drawing and hear all about your week. Mrs. Johnson says we're doing presentations about heroes next week." Zoe continued, her words tumbling over each other with excitement. "Can I talk about you? About how you make sure airplanes are safe so kids like me can visit their grandmas and stuff?" The lump in Vanessa's throat was sudden and fierce. 3 years since David had died in Afghanistan. 3 years of being both mother and father. 3 years of explaining why Mommy had to travel to scary places to do important work, and still Zoe saw her as a hero instead of the woman who missed school plays and soccer games because someone else's tragedy had called her away. "You can talk about whatever you want, baby. But remember what we always say about heroes. The best heroes aren't the ones who never make mistakes," Zoe recited dutifully. "They're the ones who make things better when somebody else does. That's my girl. I love you more than all the stars in the sky. I love you more than all the airplanes in the world, Mommy, even the ones that don't crash." After Zoe hung up, Vanessa sat in the pre-dawn darkness of her hotel room and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to feel the full weight of her exhaustion, her loneliness, and her desperate desire to be home with her daughter instead of documenting other people's worst days. Then she stood up, gathered her reports, and began the process of transforming from Dr. Vanessa Hayes, federal investigator, into just another tired traveler trying to get home. She pulled on comfortable jeans, worn soft from countless airport security lines. and her favorite navy hoodie with Howard University printed across the chest in faded gold letters. Her hair, a cascade of carefully maintained locks, was pulled back into a simple ponytail. She looked exactly like what she was. In this moment, a tired woman who wanted nothing more than to get home to her daughter, to sleep in her own bed, to be ordinary for just a little while. Her carry-on bag was government-issued black and unremarkable, containing 3 days' worth of clothes and the tools of her trade. Her laptop bag, heavier than it looked, held her credentials, her reports, and the weight of knowing that her words could ground entire fleets of aircraft or clear them to fly. But right now, walking through the Portland airport at 6:30 a.m., she was invisible, anonymous, just another face in the crowd of early morning travelers. She had no way of knowing that in exactly 4 hours, that anonymity would be shattered in a way that would make national headlines and change the lives of everyone involved, including a stressed-out gate agent who was about to make the worst mistake of her career. Ashley Cumberland had been awake for 19 hours, and it showed in the slight tremor of her hands as she shuffled through passenger manifests and the way her usually perfect platinum blonde bob was beginning to escape from its careful styling. The red vest of Global Sky Airlines felt heavier today, weighted down with the performance review that had been scheduled for next week, and the conversation with her supervisor that kept replaying in her head like a broken record. "Your customer satisfaction scores are concerning Ashley District Manager," Reynolds had said, his voice carrying that particular tone that managers use when they're building a case for termination. "We've had complaints about your approach with passengers, particularly regarding boarding procedures and carry-on enforcement. I need to see significant improvement, or we'll have to discuss other options." Other options. Corporate speak for "you're one mistake away from being unemployed." Ashley couldn't afford to be unemployed, not with Emma starting kindergarten next month and the child support that never seemed to arrive on time, not with student loans that ate up half her paycheck and a car that needed new brakes she couldn't afford to replace. Gate C-15 was already chaos at 10:30 a.m., even though Flight 892 to Detroit wasn't scheduled to depart until 11:45. The flight was oversold by 8 passengers, which meant Ashley would spend the next hour offering travel vouchers that no one wanted and trying to convince business travelers to give up their seats for the promise of future flights they didn't need. She had already dealt with 2 carry-on bags that were clearly too large a passenger, who insisted his emotional support peacock should fly in the cabin, and a man who had somehow managed to book 3 seats under different names for himself. "This is ridiculous," muttered Mrs. Henderson, a regular business traveler whose platinum status usually ensured her a smooth experience. "I've been flying for 30 years, and I've never seen such poor organization." Ashley's smile felt like it was held in place with tape and prayers. "I understand your frustration, Mrs. Henderson. We're doing everything we can to accommodate all our passengers today." But Mrs. Henderson wasn't finished. "Maybe if you people spent less time harassing passengers about their bags and more time actually organizing your flights properly, we wouldn't be in this situation." The words hit Ashley like a physical blow, not because they were necessarily unfair, but because they echoed exactly the kind of customer feedback that was already threatening her job. She felt her defensive walls going up, the same walls that had gotten her in trouble before, when passengers pushed back against policies she was required to enforce. "Ma'am, I'm following company policy," Ashley replied, her voice taking on a sharper edge than she intended. "If you'd like to speak to someone else, I can call my supervisor." Mrs. Henderson's eyes narrowed. "Maybe I will." She pulled out her phone, presumably to document whatever complaint she planned to file, and Ashley felt her chest tighten with the familiar panic that had been her constant companion for weeks. This was how it started every time. A passenger who pushed back a policy she was required to enforce, a moment where her stress and their frustration collided into something ugly that reflected poorly on her performance reviews. She had been written up twice already this year for tone issues and failure to de-escalate corporate language for the fact that she couldn't seem to make angry passengers happy no matter how hard she tried. The truth was that Ashley Cumberland had never intended to become the kind of employee who passengers complained about. When she started with Global Sky Airlines 18 months ago, fresh from her divorce and desperate for a job with health insurance, she had genuinely wanted to help people travel safely and comfortably. But 18 months of dealing with passengers who treated airline employees like personal servants of enforcing policies she didn't create and couldn't change, of working double shifts to make ends meet while raising a 5-year-old daughter on her own, had worn down her patience and her ability to smile through the constant criticism. She looked at the passenger manifest again, noting the highlighted names of the passengers who would need to be bumped from the flight, and felt the familiar knot in her stomach that came with knowing she was about to make 8 people's day significantly worse. Her supervisor's words echoed in her head, "significant improvement," or "we'll discuss other options." Ashley had grown up in a small town in Oregon where everyone knew everyone else's business, where being polite and following the rules had always been enough to get by. But working at a major international airport had shown her a side of human nature that her small-town upbringing hadn't prepared her for: the entitlement, the aggression, the way people seemed to think that buying a plane ticket gave them the right to treat airline employees however they wanted. She had started building walls around herself, adopting the defensive posture that so many service industry workers develop as protection against the daily assault on their dignity. The problem was that those walls made it harder to connect with the passengers who weren't trying to cause problems, harder to see each person as an individual rather than a potential threat to her job security. As she watched the boarding area fill up with travelers, Ashley made a silent promise to herself that she would handle today's challenges with grace and professionalism, that she would find a way to satisfy both her stressed passengers and her demanding supervisor. She had no way of knowing that in less than an hour she would be facing a situation that would test every assumption she had about authority, respect, and the power dynamics that govern human interactions in ways she could never have imagined. Dr. Vanessa Hayes approached Gate C-15 at 11:15 a.m. with the measured pace of someone who had navigated thousands of airports in her career. Someone who understood that air travel was equal parts procedure and patience. Her government-issued carry-on rolled silently behind her, its wheels well-oiled from constant use, while her laptop bag sat securely across her shoulder, heavy with the weight of federal credentials and case files that could ground aircraft or clear them for service. The gate area was the usual controlled chaos of a busy departure, with passengers clustered around charging stations and families trying to keep children entertained, while business travelers paced back and forth, phones pressed to their ears as they conducted meetings that couldn't wait for arrival. Vanessa had seen it all before, the human drama of air travel playing out in countless variations across countless airports. But today, she barely registered the familiar scene because all she could think about was getting home to Zoe and the airplane drawing with extra wings and a parachute. Her boarding pass was pulled up on her phone, the QR code ready to scan Seat 15, C-Zone 2 Global Sky Airlines Flight 892 to Detroit. Economy Plus, which meant a few extra inches of legroom and early boarding, a small comfort for what she knew would be a long day of travel. She had deliberately chosen not to use her federal credentials to upgrade to first class, preferring to travel as anonymously as possible when she wasn't on official business, to be just another passenger in the system she spent her professional life regulating. Ashley Cumberland was behind the gate podium, her platinum blonde hair catching the fluorescent lighting as she spoke into her radio with the clipped, efficient tone of someone who had repeated the same procedures hundreds of times. Vanessa could see the stress in the gate agent's posture, the slight tension in her shoulders that spoke of a long day and difficult passengers, and she felt a familiar sympathy for the front-line workers who bore the brunt of passenger frustration with policies they didn't create. Now, boarding Zone 2 Global Sky Airlines Flight 892 to Detroit. Ashley's voice echoed through the gate area, amplified by the PA system. Zone 2 passengers. Only please have your boarding passes ready. Vanessa joined the line of maybe 20 passengers, positioning herself behind a businessman who was loudly discussing quarterly reports on his phone and in front of a young couple taking selfies with their boarding passes. The line moved slowly as it always did, each passenger taking their turn at the podium to scan their pass and receive the brief acknowledgement that meant they were one step closer to their destination. When Vanessa reached the front of the line, she held out her phone with the QR code displayed clearly, expecting the quick scan and nod that would send her toward the jetway. Instead, Ashley looked at the screen, then at Vanessa's face, then down at her attire, her eyes lingering on the Howard University hoodie and the comfortable jeans that marked Vanessa as someone traveling for personal rather than business reasons. Zone 2, Ashley said, though Vanessa's boarding pass was clearly visible on the phone screen. Yes, Zone 2. Vanessa confirmed, her voice carrying the slight rasp of exhaustion and the careful patience of someone who had learned to navigate these interactions with professional calm. Ashley's eyes flicked back to the hoodie, to Vanessa's ponytailed hair, to the casual attire that didn't match whatever internal image she had of who belonged in Zone 2. Are you sure this is the right boarding group Zone 2 is for Economy Plus passengers? It was such a small thing, that moment of doubt, that assumption that someone who looked like Vanessa and dressed like Vanessa couldn't possibly have paid for the upgrade to Economy Plus. But Vanessa felt it like a familiar weight settling on her shoulders. The same weight she had carried through graduate school when professors assumed she was in the wrong classroom, through job interviews where potential employers seemed surprised by her qualifications, through security checkpoints where her federal credentials were examined with extra scrutiny. I'm sure Vanessa said, keeping her voice level and professional, calling on the same reserve of patience that had gotten her through congressional hearings where senators questioned her expertise and airline executives challenged her findings. My pass clearly shows Zone 2 Seat 15C. Ashley scanned the QR code with a sharp, jerky motion, and the screen flashed green with Vanessa's flight information. Dr. V. Hayes, 15C Zone 2 Economy Plus. For just a moment, Vanessa thought that would be the end of it, that Ashley would realize her mistake and wave her through with the apologetic smile that service workers gave when they had overstepped. Instead, Ashley's gaze dropped to Vanessa's carry-on bag, and her expression hardened into the look of someone who had decided that being wrong about one thing meant she needed to be extra right about everything else. "Your bag looks oversized," Ashley announced, her voice loud enough to carry to the passengers still waiting in line behind them. "This is a completely full flight and we don't have room for bags that don't meet regulation size." Vanessa looked down at her bag, the same regulation carry-on she had used on hundreds of flights, the same bag that had passed through security checkpoints and been approved by gate agents across the country without a single question. It was exactly the size specified in federal aviation regulations, precisely because her job required her to understand and follow those regulations better than almost anyone else in the country. "It's a standard carry-on," she replied, maintaining the even tone that had served her well in professional confrontations much more serious than this one. "I fly with it regularly and it meets all size requirements." "It looks too large to me," Ashley said, her voice taking on the sharp edge of someone who had found a rule to hide behind. "You'll need to put it in the sizer to verify." The sizer stood 3 feet away, a metal frame designed to ensure that carry-on bags met the dimensions required by federal regulation. Vanessa knew her bag would fit because she had specifically purchased it to meet those requirements, but she also recognized the game that was being played here, the way that Ashley was using the rules as a weapon to establish dominance in an interaction that had started with an incorrect assumption about who belonged in Zone 2. "Fine," Vanessa said, lifting her bag despite the protest from her shoulders that had been carrying case files and equipment for the past 3 days. She wheeled it to the sizer, lifted it again with a slight grunt of effort, and dropped it into the metal frame where it settled with room to spare on all sides. The line behind her had gone quiet. passengers sensing the tension in an interaction that should have been routine but was clearly becoming something else. Vanessa could feel their eyes on her as she pulled the bag out of the sizer and wheeled it back to Ashley's podium, the weight of being watched and judged by strangers settling over her like a familiar, unwelcome blanket. "It fits," she said simply, though the evidence was obvious to everyone who had been watching. "May I board now?" This was the moment when things should have de-escalated, when Ashley should have accepted the demonstration and moved on to the next passenger. Instead, she looked at Vanessa with the kind of cold assessment that spoke of someone who had committed to a course of action and was now looking for justification to continue. "I don't appreciate your tone," Ashley said, her voice carrying the authority of her position and the defensiveness of someone who knew she was wrong but couldn't admit it without losing face in front of the growing audience of passengers. The words "I don't appreciate your tone" hung in the air like the moment before lightning strikes, and Vanessa felt something shift in the atmosphere around Gate C-15. Something that transformed a routine boarding process into the kind of confrontation that would be talked about and analyzed and dissected for months to come. "My tone." Vanessa repeated, her voice still level, but with an undercurrent of steel that came from years of dealing with airline executives who tried to intimidate federal investigators and senators who questioned her expertise in congressional hearings. "I've been polite and cooperative. I've followed every instruction you've given me, and I've demonstrated that my bag meets federal regulations." Ashley's face flushed a deep red that clashed with her platinum blonde hair, and Vanessa recognized the look of someone who had backed herself into a corner and was now looking for a way to maintain authority in a situation where she had clearly overstepped. The problem with power, even the limited power of a gate agent checking boarding passes, was that once you started using it incorrectly, every step backward felt like a loss of face. "You've been argumentative from the moment you approached my podium," Ashley said, her voice rising enough that passengers in nearby gates were starting to turn and stare. "You questioned my authority, you challenged my assessment of your bag, and now you're being disrespectful. I'm going to have to ask you to step aside so we can continue boarding." The businessman behind Vanessa in line, a man whose name tag identified him as David Kim, stepped forward with the impatient aggression of someone whose time was being wasted by what he clearly saw as unnecessary drama. "Jesus Christ, lady, just check the bag if she says it's too big. You're holding up the entire flight." His intervention, meant to be helpful, only made things worse by adding another voice to what Ashley was now experiencing as a public challenge to her authority. Vanessa turned to him with a sharp look that made him take a step back. "Sir, I appreciate your concern about the delay, but my bag has already been proven to fit regulation size. This isn't about luggage anymore." Mrs. Eleanor Price, an elderly white woman traveling to visit her grandchildren in Detroit, had been watching the entire interaction from seat 14A in the boarding area, and she stood up with the kind of deliberate movement that suggested someone who had made a decision. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the authoritative tone of a retired teacher who had spent 40 years managing classrooms, "but I've been observing this entire situation, and this young lady has been nothing but polite and cooperative." Ashley whipped her head around to stare at Mrs. Price, clearly not expecting interference from another passenger. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but this is an airline matter. I'm handling a disruptive passenger according to company policy." "Disruptive?" Mrs. Price's eyebrows rose so high they nearly disappeared under her silver hair. "I've seen disruptive passengers, young lady, and this woman is not one of them. She's answered every question you've asked. She's demonstrated that her bag fits your requirements, and she's remained calm and professional while you've become increasingly hostile for no apparent reason." Sarah Martinez, a college student traveling home after spring break, had her phone out and the red recording light was on, capturing every word of an interaction that was quickly becoming the kind of viral content that destroys careers and sparks national conversations. She was positioned at an angle that captured both Ashley's increasingly flustered face and Vanessa's carefully controlled responses, and she had already started a live stream that was drawing viewers who sensed they were watching something significant unfold in real time. Ashley saw the phone and felt the familiar panic of someone whose job performance was already under scrutiny being recorded for potential viral infamy. "Ma'am, you need to put that phone away. This is an airline security matter, and recording is not permitted." "Actually," Vanessa interjected, her voice taking on the precise authoritative tone she used when correcting misconceptions about federal aviation law. "Passengers have the right to record interactions with airline personnel in public areas of the airport. That's established case law." The casual expertise with which Vanessa cited aviation law should have been Ashley's first clue that she was dealing with someone who understood the regulatory environment much better than the average passenger. But Ashley was too far into fight-or-flight mode to process the implications. Instead, she heard only another challenge to her authority, another example of what she was now convinced was deliberate disrespect. "That's it," Ashley announced, reaching for the red phone mounted beside her podium. "I'm calling security. This passenger is refusing to comply with crew member instructions and is creating a disturbance that is disrupting the boarding process." Dr. Kevin Torres, the airport security supervisor, was having coffee in the administrative office when the call came in. Unruly passenger at gate C15, refusing to comply with airline instructions, situation escalating. He had handled hundreds of these calls over his 15-year career, and they usually followed the same pattern: stressed passenger, overwhelmed airline employee. Simple misunderstanding that could be resolved with calm conversation and clear communication. He arrived at gate C15 3 minutes later, with Officer Johnson, a newer member of his team, who was still learning the delicate balance between supporting airline authority and de-escalating passenger conflicts. What they found was a semicircle of passengers with phones out recording an interaction between a clearly agitated blonde gate agent and a black woman in a college hoodie, who was standing perfectly still with the kind of calm that could either mean complete cooperation or complete defiance. "What's the situation here, Doctor?" Torres asked, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had seen every variation of airport conflict and knew that most of them could be resolved without anyone getting arrested or banned from flying. Ashley immediately launched into her complaint with the rapid-fire delivery of someone who was convinced she was the victim of unreasonable passenger behavior. "Officer, this passenger has been argumentative and disruptive from the moment she approached my gate. She questioned my authority regarding boarding procedures. She challenged my assessment of her carry-on bag size, and when I tried to address her tone, she became even more belligerent. She's holding up the entire flight, and I need her removed so we can proceed with boarding." Dr. Torres looked at Vanessa, taking in her tired but composed demeanor, her regulation carry-on bag, and the way she was standing with her hands visible and her posture non-threatening. In his experience, truly disruptive passengers were usually agitated, argumentative, or showing signs of intoxication or mental distress. This woman looked like someone who was exhausted and wanted to go home. "Ma'am, can you tell me your version of what happened here?" he asked, his voice respectful but official. Vanessa felt the weight of the moment settling around her like a heavy blanket, the familiar calculation that every person of color makes in situations like this: comply and hope for fairness, or stand firm and risk escalation. She thought about Zoe waiting for her at home, about the drawing of the airplane that doesn't crash, about the presentation on heroes that her daughter was planning to give. "Officer, I approached the gate with a valid boarding pass for Zone 2. The gate agent questioned whether I belonged in that boarding group, then claimed my regulation-size carry-on bag was too large. I demonstrated that the bag fits federal requirements, and I've remained calm and respectful throughout this interaction. I have not been disruptive or argumentative. I've simply asked to board my flight." Mrs. Price stepped forward again, her teacher's instincts overriding any desire to avoid involvement in someone else's conflict. "Officer, I've been watching this entire situation, and this young lady is telling the truth. She's been nothing but polite while the gate agent has become increasingly hostile for no apparent reason that I can determine. Dr. Torres found himself in the familiar position of trying to sort through competing narratives, while a crowd of passengers watched and recorded, but something about the situation felt off to him. The woman in the hoodie showed none of the signs he associated with disruptive passengers, while the gate agent was displaying the kind of defensive aggression that often indicated someone who knew they were wrong but couldn't admit it. "Ma'am," he said to Ashley, "can you tell me specifically what federal aviation regulations or airline policies this passenger has violated?" It was a fair question, the kind of question that should have been easy to answer if Vanessa had actually been disruptive or non-compliant. Ashley opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, realizing that I didn't like her tone. Wasn't actually a violation of any policy that would justify removing a passenger from a flight. She was argumentative. Ashley stammered, suddenly aware that her justifications sounded weak when stated aloud. She challenged my authority and created a disturbance. What I'm hearing, Dr. Torres said carefully, is that there was a disagreement about boarding procedures and bag size which was resolved when the passenger demonstrated compliance with regulations. Is that accurate? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Ashley realized that she was being asked to explain why a passenger should be removed for following instructions and proving compliance with airline policies. The truth was that she couldn't explain it, not in any way that wouldn't make her look like someone who had let personal bias override professional judgment. Officer Johnson, eager to support what he assumed was legitimate airline authority, stepped forward with the kind of aggressive posture that had already gotten him in trouble with supervisors who preferred de-escalation to confrontation. "Ma'am, the gate agent has asked you to step aside. You need to comply with airline personnel instructions." It was exactly the wrong thing to say and exactly the wrong tone to use, and Vanessa felt the last of her patience evaporate like morning mist in sunlight. She had spent 72 hours investigating a plane crash that could have killed 37 people. She had been traveling for 6 hours to get home to her daughter, and she was now being threatened with arrest for the crime of proving that her carry-on bag met federal regulations. "Officer," she said, her voice taking on the tone she used when addressing airline executives who tried to hide safety violations or senators who questioned her expertise, "I am not stepping aside. I have violated no laws, no regulations, and no airline policies. I am a ticketed passenger trying to board a flight home to my 9-year-old daughter, and I will not be removed for the crime of being polite while black." The words hit the gate area like a physical force, and Vanessa could see the shift in the crowd's energy as passengers who had been watching with mild curiosity suddenly understood that they were witnessing something much more serious than a routine boarding dispute. Sarah Martinez's live stream viewer count was climbing rapidly as people shared the feed, sensing that they were watching a moment that would become part of a much larger national conversation about bias, authority, and justice. At exactly the moment when Officer Johnson was reaching for his handcuffs, and Ashley was pointing an accusatory finger at Vanessa, and Dr. Torres was trying to figure out how a routine passenger complaint had turned into a potential civil rights incident. Vanessa's phone rang. The ringtone was "Isn't She Lovely" by Stevie Wonder, and anyone who knew Vanessa well would recognize it as the special tone she had set for calls from Zoe. In the tense atmosphere of Gate C-15, surrounded by security officers and angry airline personnel and a crowd of recording passengers, the cheerful melody was so incongruous that everyone stopped talking for a moment and just stared at her. "I need to take this call," Vanessa said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made Officer Johnson pause in his reach for restraints. "It's my daughter." Dr. Torres nodded, recognizing that a parent's relationship with their child transcended whatever authority dispute was playing out at the gate. "Go ahead," he said, though Ashley made a noise of protest that he silenced with a sharp look. Vanessa answered the phone, and Zoe's voice filled the space between them with the kind of pure, uncomplicated love that can cut through any amount of adult complexity and confusion. "Mommy, are you on the airplane yet? I finished my drawing, and now it has rockets too, just in case the parachute doesn't work." Despite everything, despite the stress and the accusations and the crowd of people watching her every move, Vanessa smiled. "Not yet, sweetheart. Mommy's still at the airport, but she's going to be home soon." "You sound funny," Zoe said with the perceptive innocence that children bring to conversations, the ability to hear emotions that adults try to hide. "Are you sad? Did something bad happen?" Vanessa looked around at the semicircle of people watching her, at Ashley's flushed and angry face, at the security officers who were trying to decide whether she was a threat or a victim, at the passengers recording every word for posterity and viral distribution. How do you explain to a 9-year-old that sometimes adults make things complicated for no good reason, that sometimes people make assumptions about other people based on what they look like instead of who they are? "No, baby, nothing bad happened. Mommy's just having a little disagreement with some people at the airport, but it's going to be okay." A disagreement? Zoe's voice carried the kind of serious concern that children use when they're trying to understand adult problems. Like when Emma pushes me on the playground and I tell the teacher. The comparison was so innocent and so accurate that Vanessa almost laughed, because that was exactly what this was: playground dynamics played out by adults with uniforms and authority, and the power to make each other's lives difficult. "Something like that, sweetheart." "Are they being mean to you?" Zoe asked, and the question carried the kind of protective love that made Vanessa's chest tighten with emotion. "Because you're one of the good guys, Mommy. You help people. You make airplanes safe so families don't get hurt." Mrs. Price, who had been listening to the conversation with the focused attention of someone who had spent decades around children, stepped closer and spoke loud enough for the phone to pick up her words. "Sweetie, your mommy is being very good and very patient with some people who are having a hard day. She's not doing anything wrong." "Who's that?" Zoe asked with the direct curiosity that children bring to unexpected voices. "That's Mrs. Price," Vanessa said, looking at the elderly woman with gratitude. "She's a nice lady who's been watching out for Mommy." "Hi, Mrs. Price," Zoe called out with the enthusiastic friendliness that made strangers smile in grocery stores and doctors' offices. "Thank you for being nice to my Mommy. Sometimes when people are having a hard day, they forget to be nice, but Teacher Sarah says that's when it's most important to remember that everyone's trying their best." The words hit the gate area like a small bomb of wisdom, and Vanessa could see the impact on the faces around her. Sarah Martinez's viewers were commenting rapidly on the live stream, noting the contrast between a child's simple understanding of human decency and the complex adult dynamics that had created this confrontation. Even Officer Johnson looked uncomfortable, suddenly aware that he was part of a situation that a 9-year-old could see through with perfect clarity. Ashley, however, was unmoved by the child's innocence, too committed to her version of events to allow Zoe's words to penetrate her defensive walls. "Officer, this is exactly what I'm talking about," she said, her voice sharp with frustration. "She's manipulating the situation using her child to gain sympathy. This is inappropriate behavior for a passenger." The comment landed like ice water on everyone within hearing distance, and Dr. Torres actually took a step back from Ashley, as if her words were physically offensive. Mrs. Price made a sound of disgust that carried 30 years of classroom authority, while several passengers in the crowd began muttering among themselves about the inappropriateness of criticizing a mother for talking to her child. Mommy Zoe said, her voice smaller now because she had heard the angry tone even through the phone. "Why is that lady being mean about me? I was just trying to help." Vanessa felt something harden inside her chest, something that had nothing to do with federal authority or professional expertise, and everything to do with the protective instincts of a mother whose child was being attacked by a stranger. "You weren't doing anything wrong, baby. Sometimes adults forget how to be kind to each other, but that's not your fault." "Did you tell them you're one of the good guys?" Zoe asked with the logical simplicity that children bring to problem solving. "Like, did you show them your badge and explain that you help people?" The suggestion was so innocent, so beautifully naive in its assumption that authority figures would treat each other with respect once they understood each other's roles, that Vanessa felt her throat tighten with emotion. Not yet, sweetheart. Mommy was hoping she wouldn't have to do that. But why, Zoe asked with genuine confusion. When I'm confused about something, Teacher Sarah shows me her name tag, so I know she's the teacher. Maybe if they knew you were the airplane safety lady, they would understand that you're trying to help people too. Dr. Torres, who had been listening to the conversation with growing understanding of what they might be dealing with, stepped closer to Vanessa with a new level of respect in his posture. Ma'am, your daughter mentioned your badge. Are you in law enforcement? Vanessa looked down at her phone at the image of her daughter on the screen, at the child who saw the world in terms of helpers and people who needed help, who couldn't understand why adults made things so complicated when solutions were so simple. She looked at Ashley, whose face was still flushed with defensive anger at Officer Johnson, whose hand was still resting on his handcuffs at the crowd of passengers who were recording what they assumed was just another airport confrontation. Mommy Zoe's voice was uncertain now, picking up on the tension that even a phone call couldn't hide. Are you okay? You're being really quiet. I'm okay, baby, Vanessa said, making a decision that would change everything for everyone involved. Mommy's just deciding whether to show the confused people her badge so they can understand that she's trying to help people too. I think you should, Zoe said with the confident wisdom of a child who believed that misunderstandings could always be resolved with better communication. Maybe they just don't know yet that you're one of the heroes. You're absolutely right, sweetheart, Vanessa said into the phone, her voice carrying a new note of resolve that made everyone within hearing distance pause and pay attention. Sometimes people just need to understand who they're talking to. She ended the call with Zoe after promises to be home soon and explanations about presentations on heroes, then slowly transferred her phone to her left hand while reaching for the heavy leather satchel that had been hanging across her shoulder throughout the entire confrontation. The movement was deliberate, careful, designed to be non-threatening, while also commanding attention from everyone who was watching. Dr. Torres recognized the gesture from his training in de-escalation and threat assessment, the way someone with authority moved when they were about to reveal something that would change the entire dynamic of a situation. Ma'am, he said carefully, what are you reaching for? My identification, Vanessa replied, her voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who was about to end a game that had gone on long enough. Since there seems to be some confusion about who I am and what authority I have to board this aircraft. Ashley laughed a short, bitter sound that carried all her frustration and defensiveness. Your driver's license isn't going to change the fact that you've been disruptive and non-compliant, ma'am. I've already explained to these officers that you need to be removed from the boarding area. Not my driver's license, Vanessa said, unzipping the main compartment of her satchel with the kind of precise movements that spoke of someone who was accustomed to being watched, accustomed to having their every action scrutinized and judged. My federal credentials. The words hit the gate area like a physical force, and Vanessa could see the shift in Dr. Torres's posture as he suddenly understood that he might be dealing with something much more serious than a passenger complaint. Officer Johnson took a step back, his hand moving away from his handcuffs as he realized that the situation he thought he understood was about to become something completely different. Sarah Martinez's live stream was now being watched by thousands of viewers who had been drawn by the drama of a passenger confrontation, but were staying for what they sensed was about to become a much bigger story. The comments were streaming past too fast to read, but the general sentiment was clear. Something significant was about to happen. Vanessa reached past her laptop, past her noise-canceling headphones, past the case files from the Portland investigation, and into a specialized, reinforced pocket that had been designed specifically to protect the most important items she carried. Her fingers found the familiar weight and texture of the black trifold leather wallet that held her official identification, the credentials that opened doors and commanded respect, and carried the full weight of federal authority. "Ma'am," Dr. Torres said, his voice carrying a new note of professional respect before you continue, "I want you to know that if you are a federal officer, this situation changes significantly and we need to handle it appropriately." Ashley was looking back and forth between Vanessa and Dr. Torres with growing confusion and a dawning sense that the confrontation she thought she was controlling was slipping away from her entirely. "What are you talking about? She's just a passenger. She's just trying to intimidate you with some fake ID or something," Ashley, Dr. Torres said sharply, using her first name in a way that made clear he was taking charge of the situation. "I need you to step back and let me handle this from here." Vanessa pulled the wallet from her bag with the same careful deliberation she had used to approach the satchel, holding it in a way that made clear she was not reaching for a weapon or making any threatening gestures. The black leather was worn smooth from years of use, and the weight of it in her hands carried the authority of the federal government and the responsibility of keeping millions of air travelers safe. She looked around at the semicircle of people watching her, at the passengers with their phones recording at Mrs. Price, who was leaning forward with anticipation at Ashley, whose face was beginning to show the first signs of genuine concern, as she realized that whatever was in that wallet might be more significant than she had assumed. "My name is Dr. Vanessa Hayes," she said, her voice carrying the clear, authoritative tone she used when addressing congressional committees and testifying in federal court. "I am a senior air safety investigator for the National Transportation Safety Board, currently returning from an active investigation site where I spent the past 72 hours documenting the crash of Regional Airways Flight 445 in Portland, Oregon." The silence that followed was so complete that the ambient noise of the airport seemed to disappear entirely, as if the world had paused to absorb the implications of what Vanessa had just revealed. She could see the recognition dawning on Dr. Torres's face, as he understood that he was dealing with a federal investigator whose authority in aviation matters exceeded that of anyone else in the terminal. "Dr. Hayes," he said carefully, "may I see your credentials?" Vanessa opened the wallet with the practiced motion of someone who had displayed federal identification thousands of times, revealing the gleaming gold badge of the National Transportation Safety Board, and the laminated credential card with her photograph and the seal of the Department of Transportation. The badge caught the fluorescent lighting of the terminal and seemed to glow with the weight of federal authority, while her credential card bore the unmistakable markers of genuine government identification, holograms, watermarks, and security features that couldn't be faked. Dr. Torres examined the credentials with the careful attention of someone who understood the implications of what he was seeing, noting the federal agency seal the photograph that clearly matched the woman in front of him and the title that marked her as one of the most senior aviation safety investigators in the country. When he looked up, his entire demeanor had changed from that of an airport security supervisor to that of someone addressing a federal officer. "Dr. Hayes," he said, his voice carrying formal respect, "I apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced. If you could help me understand what led to this situation, I'll ensure it's resolved appropriately." But Ashley was not ready to accept that everything she thought she understood about the situation was wrong, not ready to acknowledge that the passenger she had been trying to remove was someone whose authority in aviation matters was essentially unlimited. That could be fake," she stammered, her voice carrying desperation and denial in equal measure. "Anyone can buy a fake badge online. She's trying to intimidate us." The suggestion that a federal investigator would carry fraudulent credentials while traveling on official business was so absurd that it actually made Mrs. Price laugh out loud, a sound that carried decades of experience with people making excuses for behavior they knew was wrong. "Young lady," she said to Ashley with the tone of someone addressing a particularly obtuse student, "do you really think someone would impersonate a federal officer in an airport full of security cameras?" Sarah Martinez's live stream viewer count had climbed to over 50,000 as word spread through social media that something unprecedented was happening at an airport gate, and the comments were now a flood of people trying to understand the implications of an NTSB investigator being confronted by airline personnel. Aviation industry professionals who recognized Vanessa's name were explaining her significance to other viewers, noting that she was responsible for some of the most important safety improvements in commercial aviation history. Officer Johnson, who had been eager to support airline authority when he thought he was dealing with a disruptive passenger, was now backing away from the situation with the expression of someone who realized he had almost made a catastrophic career mistake. The idea that he had been about to arrest a federal investigator for the crime of proving her bag met regulations was so horrifying that he actually felt physically ill. Captain Rodriguez emerged from the jetway at that moment, drawn by reports of a disturbance at his gate that was delaying departure, and when he saw the crowd of passengers and security officers gathered around the boarding podium, his first thought was that there had been a security breach or a medical emergency. But when he got close enough to see Vanessa's credentials displayed in Dr. Torres's hands, his blood ran cold. "Dr. Hayes," he said, his voice carrying the horrified recognition of someone who knew exactly who she was and what her presence at his gate might mean. "Ma'am, we had no idea you were traveling on our flight today." The captain's recognition was the final piece of evidence that even Ashley couldn't deny, and she stared at Vanessa with growing horror as she understood that the passenger she had tried to have removed was someone whose job was to investigate airlines whose reports could ground entire fleets, whose recommendations shaped federal aviation policy. Captain Rodriguez Vanessa said, her voice carrying professional courtesy tinged with exhaustion. "I'm traveling as a passenger today, returning from the Portland investigation. I was hoping to board quietly and get home to my daughter." The captain looked at Ashley with an expression of absolute disbelief, then at the crowd of passengers still recording the interaction, then back at Vanessa with the expression of someone calculating how much damage had been done to his airline's reputation in the past 10 minutes. "Dr. Hayes, on behalf of Global Sky Airlines. I can only apologize for whatever misunderstanding led to this situation. Please allow me to personally ensure you're accommodated appropriately." But Vanessa was looking at Ashley, whose face had gone completely white as the full implications of her actions began to sink in. "Ms. Cumberland," she said, reading the name tag with deliberate precision, "I want you to understand something very clearly. I am not angry with you. I am not seeking revenge or punishment. But I am deeply concerned about what this interaction reveals about how your airline treats passengers who don't fit certain expectations." The transformation of Gate C-15 in the moments following Vanessa's credential reveal was like watching a time-lapse video of a controlled demolition, where everything that had seemed solid and permanent suddenly crumbled into dust and confusion. Ashley Cumberland stood behind her podium, as if it were the only thing keeping her upright, her platinum blonde hair now disheveled from running her hands through it, her face cycling through expressions of disbelief, horror, and dawning recognition of the magnitude of her mistake. "Dr. Hayes." Captain Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the careful formality of someone who understood that every word would likely be scrutinized by federal investigators, congressional committees, and civil rights organizations. "Please allow me to personally escort you to the aircraft. We can arrange an upgrade to first-class expedited boarding, whatever would help make up for this inexcusable situation." But Vanessa was looking past the captain, past the security officers who were now treating her with the deference due to federal authority, past the crowd of passengers who were still recording and would shortly make this the most watched airport confrontation in social media history. She was looking at Ashley, whose career had just ended in the span of 10 minutes, whose assumptions and biases had collided with reality in the most public and devastating way possible. "Ms. Cumberland," she said, her voice gentle in a way that somehow made the situation more rather than less serious. "Do you understand what just happened here?" Ashley's mouth opened and closed several times before any sound emerged, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. You're really NTSB. You're really a federal investigator. I am? Vanessa confirmed, closing her credentials wallet and returning it to her bag with the same careful movement she had used to retrieve it. I spend my professional life investigating aviation accidents, analyzing safety failures, and making recommendations that are designed to prevent tragedies. I brief members of Congress, I testify in federal court, and I write reports that can ground entire aircraft fleets if I determine they pose a safety risk. The words were delivered without emotion, simple statements of fact that nevertheless carried the weight of absolute authority in the aviation industry. Sarah Martinez's live stream chat was exploding with aviation professionals who recognized the implications. Dr. Vanessa Hayes was not just any federal investigator. She was one of the most respected voices in aviation safety, someone whose recommendations shaped policy at the highest levels of government. I have dedicated my career to making air travel safer, Vanessa continued, which means I have dedicated my career to protecting passengers exactly like the ones standing in this gate area right now. And today I was treated as a security threat for the crime of following federal regulations while traveling to visit my 9-year-old daughter. Dr. Torres stepped forward, his expression serious as he began to understand the full scope of what had occurred under his watch. Dr. Hayes, I need to formally apologize for the way this situation was handled. Airport security should have de-escalated rather than supported what was clearly a passenger service issue. Officer Torres Vanessa said, reading his name tag, you responded to a call from airline personnel reporting a disruptive passenger. You had no way of knowing that the call was based on incorrect assumptions rather than actual passenger behavior. But I do hope this will serve as a learning experience about the importance of independent assessment rather than automatic deference to whoever makes the complaint. Mrs. Price, who had been watching the entire exchange with the focused attention of someone taking mental notes for the strongly worded letter she planned to write, stepped closer to Ashley with the kind of purposeful movement that made everyone else step back. Young lady, she said, her voice carrying 40 years of classroom authority. I want you to understand something very important. I watched this entire interaction from the beginning, and Dr. Hayes was polite, patient, and cooperative throughout. She answered every question you asked, she followed every instruction you gave, and she proved her compliance with federal regulations. Your behavior was unprofessional, biased, and completely inappropriate. Ashley was crying now, tears of shame and fear in recognition of the career suicide she had just committed, streaming down her cheeks as she struggled to process the reality that the passenger she had tried to have arrested was someone whose authority in aviation matters was essentially unlimited. I didn't know. She stammered, though. Even as she said the words, she understood that ignorance of Vanessa's credentials didn't excuse the assumptions and biases that had led to the confrontation. You didn't know I was a federal investigator, Vanessa agreed. But you also didn't know anything else about me. You didn't know that I'm a mother trying to get home to her daughter after 3 days documenting a plane crash. You didn't know that I hold advanced degrees in aerospace engineering and metallurgy. You didn't know that I've testified before Congress about aviation safety. You made assumptions based on what I looked like and how I was dressed, and you treated me accordingly. The gate area had become completely silent, except for the ambient noise of the airport and the soft sobbing coming from Ashley, who was beginning to understand that this wasn't just a customer service failure, but a viral moment that would follow her for the rest of her career. Captain Rodriguez was already on his phone with corporate headquarters, his voice low and urgent, as he tried to explain the situation to executives who would soon be dealing with calls from reporters, civil rights organizations, and congressional staffers. Dr. Hayes, he said after ending his call, my district manager is en route and our corporate legal team is being briefed on the situation. I want you to know that Global Sky Airlines takes this matter with the utmost seriousness, and we are prepared to take immediate corrective action." Captain Vanessa replied, "I appreciate your concern, but my primary interest right now is getting home to my daughter. However, I do want you to understand that this incident will be included in my regular reports to the Department of Transportation about industry culture and passenger treatment. Not as retaliation, but as data about the environment that airline passengers face when they don't fit certain expectations. The threat was delivered so calmly, so professionally, that it took a moment for the full implications to sink in. Dr. Vanessa Hayes didn't just investigate plane crashes. She also reported on industry practices, corporate culture, and pattern issues that affected aviation safety. Her observations about passenger treatment could influence federal oversight, congressional hearings, and regulatory decisions that would affect Global Sky Airlines for years to come. Officer Johnson, who had spent the past 15 minutes contemplating the career disaster he had narrowly avoided, stepped forward with the expression of someone who needed to make things right. "Dr. Hayes, I want to formally apologize for my role in escalating this situation. I should have assessed the circumstances independently rather than assuming the passenger complaint was justified," Officer Johnson Vanessa said, noting his name tag. "I appreciate your apology. I hope this experience will inform your approach to similar situations in the future. The goal should always be de-escalation and fair treatment for everyone involved." Sarah Martinez, whose live stream had now reached over 100,000 viewers and was being shared across every social media platform, finally lowered her phone and approached Vanessa with the expression of someone who understood she had witnessed something historically significant. "Dr. Hayes, I'm a journalism student and I've been recording this interaction. Do you have any comment about what happened here today?" Vanessa looked at the young woman, noting the serious expression and the way she held herself with professional dignity despite her youth. "I hope that people who watch your recording will understand that bias and assumptions about who belongs where can affect anyone, regardless of their credentials or authority. The goal should be treating all passengers with dignity and respect, not because of who they might turn out to be, but because it's the right thing to do." The executive conference room on the 38th floor of Global Sky Airlines corporate headquarters in Chicago had seen its share of crisis management meetings over the years, but the emergency session, called for 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, carried a level of urgency that had everyone from the CEO to the junior legal associates moving with the controlled panic of people trying to contain a disaster that was already spiraling beyond their ability to manage. Richard Morrison, the CEO, who had spent the past 18 months trying to rebuild the airline's reputation after a series of customer service failures and safety incidents, stared at the tablet displaying Sarah Martinez's viral video with the expression of someone watching his career implode in real time. The view count had climbed to over 2 million in just 4 hours, and the comments section was a devastating mix of outrage, industry analysis, and promises to never fly Global Sky Airlines again. "How bad is it?" he asked Jessica Riley, the Vice President of Public Relations, though the question was rhetorical because they could all see exactly how bad it was in the trending hashtags and the phone calls that were flooding in from reporters, congressional offices, and civil rights organizations. "It's extinction-level bad," Jessica replied, her voice carrying the flat tone of someone delivering news that couldn't be softened or spun. "We're trending on every major platform. The aviation trade publications are running analysis pieces about Dr. Hayes' significance in the industry, and I've got calls from CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and 63 other media outlets requesting statements and interviews." The legal department had assembled a rapid response team led by senior counsel David Chen, who had spent the morning reviewing federal employment law civil rights statutes and the specific regulations governing the treatment of federal investigators. His preliminary assessment was presented in the kind of careful, measured language that lawyers use when delivering catastrophically bad news. From a legal standpoint, he began, "We're facing potential exposure on multiple fronts. Dr. Hayes is a federal investigator who was profiled and harassed by our employee while traveling in an official capacity. That creates potential claims under federal civil rights law, employment discrimination statutes, and Section 1983 violations for interference with a federal officer's duties. Morrison rubbed his temples, feeling the onset of the kind of headache that came with realizing that a single employee's bad decision was about to cost the company millions of dollars and months of congressional oversight. What's our exposure if she decides to file suit conservatively 8 figures? But the financial exposure is actually the least of our problems. Chen continued. Dr. Hayes has the authority to include this incident in her regular reports to the Department of Transportation. She can flag our company for pattern discrimination issues, which could trigger federal oversight, congressional hearings, and regulatory scrutiny that would make our recent safety review look like a gentle suggestion. The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications of having one of the most respected voices in aviation safety personally documenting discrimination by Global Sky Airlines personnel. It wasn't just about one incident or one lawsuit. It was about being flagged as a problem company by the very federal agency responsible for ensuring aviation safety and passenger protection. "Where's the stock price?" Morrison asked, though he already knew the answer would be painful. "Down 12% and falling," reported CFO Angela Martinez. "That's about $400 million in market cap, lost in the first 6 hours. The institutional investors are calling for statements, and our insurance carriers are reviewing their exposure for the inevitable civil rights litigation." Jessica Riley's phone buzzed with another urgent call, and she glanced at the screen with the expression of someone dealing with an avalanche of crisis communications. "That's the 4th call from congressional offices. The House Transportation Committee wants a briefing on our passenger service protocols, and Senator Williams's office is asking whether we have a pattern of discriminating against federal investigators." The question hung in the air like an accusation because everyone in the room knew that this wasn't an isolated incident, but rather the most public and damaging example of customer service problems that had been documented in internal reviews and passenger complaints for months. Ashley Cumberland's confrontation with Dr. Hayes was viral because it was captured on video, but similar incidents had been reported and quietly settled throughout the company's recent history. "What's our position on the employee?" Morrison asked, though they all knew that Ashley Cumberland's termination was inevitable, regardless of any personal sympathy they might have for someone whose career had been destroyed by a single catastrophic error in judgment. "She's been suspended pending investigation, but that's just a formality," replied Human Resources Director Maria Santos. "Her employment will be terminated effective immediately. The question is whether we try to frame this as a rogue employee situation or acknowledge broader cultural issues that need to be addressed." The strategic implications of that choice were enormous, because characterizing Ashley as a rogue employee would limit the company's legal exposure, but invite scrutiny of their hiring and training practices, while acknowledging cultural problems would demonstrate corporate responsibility, but open the door to broader discrimination claims from other affected passengers. "What does Dr. Hayes want?" Morrison asked, hoping that federal investigators might be interested in the kind of financial settlement that would make the problem disappear quietly and quickly. "That's the interesting part," Jessica replied, checking her notes from the preliminary outreach efforts. "Our airport operations manager tried to offer her first-class upgrades travel vouchers and a personal apology from senior management. She declined everything and said she wasn't interested in what she called gesture compensation, but rather in meaningful changes to passenger treatment protocols. The response was both better and worse than they had hoped, because Dr. Hayes's lack of interest in financial compensation meant she couldn't be bought off with the standard crisis management playbook. But it also suggested that she might be open to collaborative solutions that would benefit the company's long-term reputation, rather than simply seeking maximum punitive damages. Morrison made the decision that would define Global Sky Airlines' response to the crisis and ultimately determine whether the company emerged stronger or weaker from the viral confrontation. "Get me a meeting with Dr. Hayes. Not through lawyers, not through intermediaries, but a direct conversation between executives who understand that this is about more than one incident or one employee. We need to understand what meaningful change looks like, and we need to implement it before this becomes a federal case study in how not to treat passengers. The room erupted in activity as staff members began coordinating the kind of high-level crisis response that corporations deploy when their survival depends on getting everything exactly right in the aftermath of getting everything exactly wrong. Phone calls were made to congressional liaisons. Media statements were drafted and redrafted, and emergency meetings were scheduled with diversity consultants and civil rights organizations. But in the back of everyone's mind was the understanding that no amount of crisis management could undo the viral video of Ashley Cumberland calling security on Dr. Vanessa Hayes, and no amount of corporate apologies could erase the moment when a federal aviation safety investigator had been forced to display her credentials to board a flight home to her 9-year-old daughter. The damage was done, recorded, and spreading across the internet at the speed of social media outrage. The only question now was whether Global Sky Airlines could learn from the disaster quickly enough to prevent it from happening again, or whether this would become the moment that defined their corporate culture for years to come. 3 days after the confrontation at Gate C, 15 became the most watched airport incident in social media history. Dr. Vanessa Hayes sat in a comfortable conference room at the offices of the Civil Rights Advocacy Center in downtown Detroit, looking across a polished wooden table at Ashley Cumberland, whose life had been turned upside down by 10 minutes of viral infamy that would follow her for the rest of her career. The mediation had been arranged by Dr. Eleanor Washington, a respected civil rights attorney, who specialized in facilitating dialogues between parties in high-profile discrimination cases, and the room had been carefully prepared to encourage honest conversation rather than defensive posturing. Soft lighting, comfortable chairs, tissues available on every table, and no cameras or recording devices to create additional pressure for anyone involved. Ashley looked smaller than she had behind the gate podium, diminished by the weight of public shame and the recognition of how profoundly she had misunderstood the situation she was trying to control. Her platinum blonde hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a modest gray dress that suggested someone who was no longer trying to project authority, but rather hoping to find some path toward redemption and understanding. Dr. Hayes. She began, her voice barely above a whisper. I know that anything I say is going to sound like an excuse, but I need you to understand that I never intended for things to escalate the way they did. I was having the worst day of my career. I was stressed about my performance review, and when you approached my gate, I made assumptions that I know now were completely wrong. Vanessa listened without interrupting, noting the way Ashley struggled to find words that could somehow explain behavior that had been captured on video for the world to see and judge. Ashley, she said finally, I appreciate your willingness to have this conversation, but I need you to understand that impact matters more than intent. Your assumptions, regardless of what motivated them, led to a federal investigator being treated as a security threat for following airline regulations. I know Ashley said, tears beginning to form in her eyes as she faced the full weight of what her biases had created. I've watched the video hundreds of times, and every time I see it, I understand more clearly how wrong I was. You were polite. You followed every instruction I gave you. You proved that your bag met regulations, and I still called security because I didn't look like what you expected a federal investigator to look like. Vanessa finished gently. Because I was wearing a college sweatshirt instead of a business suit, because I'm a black woman traveling alone, because your assumptions about who belongs in certain spaces overrode the evidence that was right in front of you. The words were delivered without anger, which somehow made them more rather than less powerful, and Ashley nodded as she accepted the truth that she had been avoiding since the incident went viral. Yes, she admitted. That's exactly what happened. And I know that saying I'm sorry doesn't fix the damage I caused, but I am sorry. I'm sorry for the way I treated you. I'm sorry for the assumptions I made, and I'm sorry that it took this public humiliation for me to understand how my biases were affecting other people. Dr. Washington leaned forward slightly, recognizing the moment when defensive walls began to come down and real dialogue became possible. Ashley, can you help us understand what was going through your mind during those crucial moments when the situation was escalating? What were you feeling, and what was driving your decisions? Ashley took a shaky breath, clearly struggling with the vulnerability required to examine her own motivations. Honestly, I was scared, she admitted. Not of Dr. Hayes, but of losing my job. I'd already been written up twice for customer service issues, and my supervisor had told me that I needed to show significant improvement or I'd be terminated. When Dr. Hayes questioned my assessment of her boarding group and her bag size, I felt like my authority was being challenged and I panicked. So you doubled down instead of stepping back and reassessing the situation, Vanessa observed. Exactly, Ashley confirmed. And the more she remained calm and professional, the more threatened I felt because her composure made it obvious that I was the one who was out of control. I called security not because she was actually disruptive, but because I needed to be right about something, anything after being wrong about everything else. The admission hung in the room like a confession, honest and painful, and more revealing than anything captured on the viral video. Vanessa found herself feeling something unexpected sympathy for a young woman whose career had been destroyed by a toxic combination of workplace pressure, unconscious bias, and the human tendency to make bad decisions worse when pride gets involved. At that moment, Dr. Washington's assistant knocked softly and entered with a tablet displaying a video call connection. Dr. Hayes, your daughter's calling is scheduled. Vanessa accepted the tablet with a smile, and Zoe's face appeared on the screen with the kind of boundless energy that only 9-year-olds possess. Her braids tied with bright yellow ribbons and her gap-toothed grin filling the frame. Mommy, how's your meeting going? Are you making friends with the lady who was confused about your job? Ashley's eyes widened as she realized she was looking at the child whose innocent phone call had become part of the viral video, the little girl whose wisdom about helpers and heroes had provided the moral clarity that so many adults had struggled to find. It's going well, sweetheart, Vanessa replied. Ashley is here and we're having a good conversation about how to make sure other people don't get confused the same way. Hi, Ashley, Zoe called out with the enthusiastic friendliness that children bring to meeting new people. I'm Zoe. Mommy told me you were having a hard day when you met her. Are you feeling better now? Ashley stared at the screen, completely unprepared for the generous spirit of a child who had every reason to think poorly of her, but instead offered the kind of uncomplicated kindness that adults often lose in their pursuit of being right instead of being good. Hi, Zoe, she managed, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, I'm feeling better now. Thank you for asking. Good, Zoe continued with the matter-of-fact problem-solving approach that children bring to complex adult situations. Mommy says sometimes when people are confused about stuff, they just need someone to explain things nicely. Did she show you her badge? It's really cool. She has it because she's one of the airplane safety people who make sure families don't get hurt when they fly. She did show me her badge, Ashley confirmed, looking at Vanessa with a new understanding of what she had almost prevented a mother returning home to a daughter who saw her as a hero. A family reunion that had been threatened by assumptions and biases that had nothing to do with actual safety or security. Are you going to help make flying safer too? Zoe asked with the innocent expectation that adults should use their experiences to help other people rather than just feeling bad about mistakes. Ashley looked at Vanessa, then at Dr. Washington, then back at the 9-year-old on the screen who was asking whether she planned to transform her shame into something constructive. I'd like to try, Zoe. I think I could help other people understand what I learned about not making assumptions about people. That's good, Zoe announced with the satisfied tone of someone whose problem-solving suggestion had been accepted. Mommy always says the best helpers are the ones who made mistakes and learned how to do better. Maybe you could teach other airline people about that? After ending the call with Zoe, the room fell into a thoughtful silence as everyone processed the wisdom of a child who had cut through all the adult complexity to identify exactly what needed to happen next, transform the mistake into a teaching moment that would prevent similar situations for other travelers. Ashley. Dr. Washington said Zoe raised an interesting possibility. Would you be willing to work with Global Sky Airlines and civil rights organizations to develop training programs that address the unconscious biases that led to this incident? Yes, Ashley said without hesitation, understanding that this might be her only path toward redemption and meaningful contribution after the destruction of her original career. If Dr. Hayes and Global Sky Airlines would trust me with that responsibility, I would consider it an honor to help prevent other people from experiencing what she went through. Vanessa studied Ashley's face, looking for signs of performative contrition versus genuine understanding, and found something that surprised her. Not just remorse for being caught on camera, but real recognition of the harm that had been caused and sincere commitment to being part of the solution. I think Vanessa said carefully that might be exactly what's needed. Not perfect people teaching about bias, but people who have confronted their own assumptions and learned from the consequences. People who can speak honestly about how good intentions and workplace pressure can still lead to discriminatory behavior. The agreement that emerged from that conversation would reshape how Global Sky Airlines approached passenger service training, but more importantly, it would transform Ashley Cumberland from a viral symbol of workplace bias into a powerful voice for change. Someone whose story could help other airline employees recognize and interrupt their own unconscious assumptions before those assumptions hurt real people trying to get home to their families. 6 months later, Dr. Vanessa Hayes stood in the auditorium of the Global Sky Airlines training facility outside Chicago, watching Ashley Cumberland address a room full of gate agents, flight attendants, and customer service representatives with the kind of vulnerable honesty that can only come from someone who has faced the worst consequences of their own unconscious biases and chosen to learn from the experience rather than simply hide from it. "My name is Ashley Cumberland," she was saying to the assembled employees, "and 6 months ago I called security on a federal aviation safety investigator because she was a black woman in a college sweatshirt who didn't match my assumptions about what authority looks like. That decision, captured on video and watched by millions of people, didn't just end my career as a gate agent. It became a national conversation about bias assumptions and the way we treat passengers who don't fit our expectations." The room was completely silent because everyone there had seen the viral video and understood that they were hearing from someone who had become a symbol of everything that could go wrong when workplace pressure combined with unconscious bias to create discriminatory treatment of passengers. But they were also hearing from someone who had chosen to confront her mistakes publicly rather than disappearing into private shame. "I want you to understand," Ashley continued, "that I never thought of myself as a biased person. I never consciously decided to treat passengers differently based on race or class or appearance. But when Dr. Hayes approached my gate, I made a series of assumptions based on what she looked like and how she was dressed, and those assumptions led me to question her boarding group, challenge her bag size, and ultimately call security on someone who was following every regulation and being completely cooperative." Vanessa, sitting in the back of the auditorium as an observer rather than a participant, watched the faces of the airline employees as they processed Ashley's story. Some looked uncomfortable, recognizing their own tendencies to make similar assumptions. Others looked skeptical, perhaps thinking they would never make such an obvious mistake. A few looked engaged and thoughtful, understanding that the training they were receiving was designed to help them recognize and interrupt the same kind of unconscious biases that had destroyed Ashley's original career. The hardest part for me to accept Ashley was saying, was that Dr. Hayes never raised her voice, never became argumentative, never did anything that justified my escalation of the situation. She answered every question I asked, she followed every instruction I gave, and she proved that her bag met federal regulations. But I still called security because I couldn't admit that my assumptions were wrong without losing face in front of a gate full of passengers. The training program that had emerged from the mediated dialogue between Vanessa and Ashley was unlike anything Global Sky Airlines had implemented before, because it focused not just on policies and procedures, but on the psychological and social dynamics that led well-meaning employees to treat passengers unfairly. Ashley's willingness to share her story had become the centerpiece of a comprehensive approach to bias recognition that was already being adopted by other airlines throughout the industry. Dr. Hayes could have destroyed my life completely. Ashley continued, and honestly, she would have been justified in doing so. Instead, she chose to work with me and with this company to create something positive from my mistake. She chose education over punishment, understanding over revenge, and that choice gave me the opportunity to become someone who helps prevent other people from experiencing what she went through. After Ashley finished her presentation and the formal training session concluded, Vanessa approached her in the corridor outside the auditorium, noting how different she looked from the defensive, flustered gate agent who had called security 6 months earlier. There was a confidence in Ashley's posture now, but it was the confidence of someone who had faced her own worst impulses and chosen to grow from the experience rather than the brittle defensiveness of someone protecting a false sense of authority. "How are you doing with all this?" Vanessa asked, gesturing toward the auditorium where Ashley had just shared her story with 50 airline employees who would carry those lessons into thousands of future passenger interactions. "Some days are harder than others," Ashley admitted. "There are still people who recognize me from the video, and not all of them are interested in hearing about redemption and learning. But Zoe was right when she said that the best helpers are the ones who made mistakes and learned how to do better. This work helping other people recognize their biases before those biases hurt passengers, it feels like the most important thing I've ever done." They walked together toward the parking lot, two women whose lives had been forever changed by 10 minutes at an airport gate, but who had chosen to transform that confrontation into something that would protect other travelers from similar experiences. The afternoon sun was warm on their faces, and Vanessa found herself thinking about Zoe's upcoming presentation on Heroes, the one that had been postponed while they worked through the aftermath of the viral incident. "Ashley," she said as they reached their cars, "Zoe is giving her presentation about heroes next week, and she's decided to talk about people who turn bad situations into good ones. She specifically asked if you could be there to tell your story to her class." Ashley stopped walking and stared at Vanessa with an expression of surprise and gratitude so profound that it made clear how much the invitation meant to her. She wants me to talk to her class. After everything that happened, she says you're the perfect example of what she learned about heroes," Vanessa replied with a smile. "That the best ones aren't people who never make mistakes, but people who make things better when somebody else does. And she thinks other kids should know that it's possible to learn and grow from even the worst mistakes." 6 months after the confrontation that had made national headlines and destroyed one career while elevating another, Dr. Vanessa Hayes boarded another flight for another investigation, this time departing from Detroit Metropolitan Airport for a safety review in Seattle. As she approached the Global Sky Airlines gate, she noticed something that would have been impossible before the viral incident. The gate agent, a young man whose name tag read Marcus Johnson, looked up from his computer as she approached and greeted her with the kind of genuine professional courtesy that recognized her as a valued passenger rather than a potential problem to be managed. "Good morning, Dr. Hayes," he said, scanning her boarding pass with efficient professionalism. "Thank you for flying Global Sky Airlines today. We're honored to have you traveling with us." The recognition was not based on her appearance or her attire, which today included another comfortable hoodie and jeans for the long travel day ahead, but on the passenger manifest that now included a notation system designed to ensure that federal investigators and other VIP travelers received appropriate service regardless of how they chose to dress for personal travel. But more importantly, Marcus's training had included Ashley Cumberland's story, and he understood that every passenger deserved to be treated with dignity and respect, not because of who they might turn out to be, but because it was the right thing to do. The Hays Standard, as it had come to be known throughout the industry, was not about special treatment for federal investigators, but about consistent, respectful treatment for all passengers, regardless of their appearance, attire, or perceived social status. As Vanessa settled into her seat for the flight to Seattle, she pulled out her phone and opened the text messages from Zoe, whose hero presentation had been a tremendous success, and who was now planning a career in helping people solve problems without anyone getting hurt, a 9-year-old's perfect description of conflict resolution and restorative justice. The airplane pushed back from the gate on schedule, and as it climbed into the clear Detroit morning, Vanessa reflected on the chain of events that had begun with Ashley Cumberland's assumptions and escalated into a national conversation about bias authority and the importance of treating every person with dignity, regardless of whether they fit our expectations about who belongs where. The confrontation at Gate C-15 had lasted only 10 minutes, but its impact would continue for years in the form of training programs, policy changes, and individual moments of recognition, when airline employees chose understanding over assumption, patience over prejudice, and respect over the false authority that comes from treating other people as problems to be solved rather than human beings deserving of basic dignity. And somewhere in Detroit, a 9-year-old girl was drawing airplanes with extra wings and parachutes and rockets just in case, while planning her next presentation about heroes who turn bad situations into good ones. Because her mother had taught her that the best way to change the world was one conversation, one understanding, and one act of courage at a time. If this story of justice and transformation moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more real-life accounts of courage in the face of bias. Share your thoughts about how one moment of confrontation became a movement for change. And let us know in the comments about times you've witnessed the power of choosing understanding over revenge. Together we can build a world where dignity and respect aren't upgrades you have to earn, but basic rights that everyone deserves from the moment they step into any space. Whether it's an airport, a workplace, or anywhere else where human beings interact with the power to lift each other up or tear each other down.